Tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. Hit the like button, and let's begin the story. Elias was 10 years old when he learned that invisible children don't exist in official records, but they exist everywhere else. In the shadows of alleys, under highway overpasses, in the gaps between society's carefully organized structures. His parents had died 3 years earlier in a house fire in a forgotten town in rural Nevada. No extended family. No legal guardians. No one who stepped forward to claim him. For 6 months, he moved through the foster care system. 3 different homes, each more indifferent than the last. Then one day, during a chaotic transfer between facilities, Elias simply walked away. He was 7 years old, and no one filed a missing persons report. He had become a statistic that fell through the cracks. The streets taught him quickly how to recognize which dumpsters behind which restaurants had the best discarded food, how to sleep light enough to wake at footsteps, how to make himself small when adults looked his direction, how to survive on nothing. For 3 years, Elias lived in the margins of Millerton, a dying town 2 hours from anywhere important. Once a thriving mining community, it had slowly bled population for decades. Empty storefronts lined Main Street. The old cinema had been abandoned for 20 years. Half the houses stood vacant, windows dark, lawns overgrown. It was the kind of place people left, not the kind they moved to. Elias learned every corner of Millerton's decay. He slept in the old bus station storage room during winter. He bathed in the creek behind the closed lumber mill. He read discarded newspapers to keep his mind working, teaching himself things no one else would teach him. The townspeople knew he existed. They saw him digging through trash. They saw him sleeping on benches. They saw him, but they looked away. Mrs. Chun at the corner store sometimes left day-old bread in a box by the back door, never acknowledging it was for him. Father Martinez at St. Anthony's let him sleep in the church basement 3 nights when temperatures dropped below freezing, but told him he couldn't stay permanently. Officer Bradshaw threatened him twice with juvenile detention if he didn't find somewhere else to be. But no one offered him a home. No one asked his name. No one treated him like he mattered. To Millerton, Elias was evidence of a problem they didn't want to acknowledge, so they pretended not to see him at all. It was in early November when everything changed. The town council had voted on what they called a community renewal initiative. In practice, it meant sweeping the streets of anything that made Millerton look bad to potential investors. That included homeless people. That included Elias. Sheriff's deputies began patrolling with new instructions. Round up vagrants. Clear them out. Make the town look clean and safe. Elias watched from the shadows as they arrested an older homeless man named Joe who slept near the old train depot. Joe hadn't done anything wrong. He'd just been existing in a place where his existence was no longer tolerated. They put him in the back of a patrol car, and Elias never saw him again. That night, Elias made his decision. He couldn't stay in Millerton anymore. The next morning before dawn, he gathered everything he owned: a torn backpack, 2 changes of clothes, a broken compass he'd found, a water bottle, and a jackknife with a rusted blade. He walked east toward the mountains that rose like a wall beyond the town. He'd heard stories about the old ruins up there. Silver Ridge, an abandoned mining town from the 1880s that had thrived for barely 20 years before the silver ran out and everyone left. A ghost town slowly being reclaimed by the desert and wind. It was 5 miles into the mountains along a dirt road that barely existed anymore. No one went there. No one would look for him there. He could disappear completely. The hike took most of the day. Elias had never walked that far before. His shoes, donated sneakers 2 sizes too small, rubbed blisters that bled into his socks. The November sun was deceptively warm during the day, but promised brutal cold at night. He rationed the single bottle of water he carried, taking tiny sips every hour. By late afternoon, he reached Silver Ridge. The town was more ruined than he'd imagined. What had once been a community of several hundred people was now a collection of skeletal structures, collapsed roofs, walls reduced to piles of weathered wood, foundations filled with decades of blown sand and tumbleweeds. The main street was still barely visible, though sagebrush had broken through the packed earth. A few buildings remained partially intact: the old assayer's office, a general store with its false front still standing, and several houses that had somehow resisted complete collapse. Everything was silent except for the wind. Elias explored carefully, testing floors before stepping on them, watching for snakes and unstable walls. He found the least damaged house at the edge of town, a small structure that must have belonged to a mine worker's family. 3 of the 4 walls stood solid. Part of the roof remained. The interior was filled with sand and debris, but it was shelter. That first night in the ruins was the longest of Elias's life. The temperature dropped viciously after sunset. He had no blankets, no fire, no warmth except what his own body could generate curled into the smallest possible shape against the corner of the ruined house. The darkness was absolute. The silence was broken only by distant coyote calls and the creak of old wood settling in the cold. Elias shivered violently, teeth chattering so hard his jaw ached. He thought about his parents. He thought about the last time he'd slept in an actual bed. He thought about whether anyone in the world knew or cared that he existed. And he cried, finally allowing himself the luxury of tears he usually suppressed. But when dawn came, he was still alive. And that meant he could survive another day. Over the following weeks, Elias transformed survival into something resembling life. He cleared the debris from the ruined house, creating a space protected from wind. He gathered pieces of corrugated metal from other collapsed buildings and used them to patch holes in the roof. He found an old metal tub and positioned it to collect rainwater, precious in the desert, but enough to keep him alive. He scavenged rusted tools from the ruins and used them to dig for edible roots he'd read about in survival guides he'd studied in Millerton's library. There was a desert willow growing wild near the old church. Its seeds were edible. Its bark could be boiled for medicine. He learned which lizards were safe to catch and eat. He learned how to start fires using the broken compass as a makeshift magnifying glass. He learned that solitude was different from loneliness, that in the silence of the ruins, he could hear his own thoughts clearly for the first time in years. Occasionally, people came to Silver Ridge. Teenagers from Millerton looking for a place to drink and vandalize. Photographers documenting decay. Curious tourists with expensive cameras. When Elias heard vehicles approaching, he hid in the tunnels beneath the old church, mine shafts that had once accessed silver veins beneath the town. He watched from shadows as visitors wandered through the ruins, taking pictures, laughing at the creepy ghost town. They never stayed long. They never imagined someone actually lived there. One day in December, Elias overheard a conversation that changed everything. A group of men in their 20s had driven up in a pickup truck, carrying beer and metal detectors. "My grandfather said there's still silver in these mountains," one of them said. "Not in the old mines, those were tapped out. But supposedly the company hid a massive final haul somewhere before they abandoned the town." "That's a legend, man," another replied. "Every ghost town has a buried treasure story." Yeah, but he had documents, maps. He worked for the mining company in the 1950s when they were trying to reopen operations. They found something that made them seal everything up and leave immediately. "So why didn't your grandfather come get it?" "He tried. Died of a heart attack before he could." The men wandered around for 2 hours, sweeping metal detectors over the ground, finding nothing but old nails and bottle caps. Eventually, they gave up and drove away. But Elias couldn't stop thinking about what they'd said. A massive final haul hidden somewhere in Silver Ridge. Documents. Maps. Something that made a mining company abandon everything. That night, unable to sleep, Elias began systematically exploring areas of the ruins he'd previously avoided. The old company office had collapsed entirely, reduced to a pile of rotted timber. The assayer's building was too dangerous, its walls tilted at angles that promised imminent collapse. But there was one structure he'd never fully investigated: the old mine superintendent's house. It stood at the highest point of Silver Ridge, overlooking the entire ghost town. Larger than the other houses, it had been built with better materials, Stone foundation, thick timber walls, real glass windows long since shattered. Elias had avoided it because it was the most visible structure in town, and he didn't want to risk being seen if anyone visited. But now, driven by curiosity and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, there was something valuable enough to change his circumstances, he approached it. The front door had rotted off its hinges decades ago. The interior was a chaos of collapsed ceiling beams, broken furniture, and thick dust. Elias moved carefully, testing each step. The main room had caved in, but a hallway along the side of the house remained relatively intact. He followed it to what had once been a study or office. A heavy desk sat against one wall, its drawers long ago emptied by looters or time. Bookcases had collapsed, scattering brittle, unreadable books across the floor. But something caught his attention. The floor beneath the desk looked wrong. While the rest of the room's floor was wooden planks covered in dust and debris, the section under the desk was stone, deliberately placed stone that didn't match the foundation pattern of the rest of the house. Elias knelt and brushed away years of accumulated dirt. Beneath the dust, he could see the edges of individual stones fitted together, not randomly, but in a deliberate rectangular pattern. A sealed hatch. His heart began pounding. He tried to pry up the stones with his fingers, but they wouldn't budge. He retrieved his rusted jackknife and used it to scrape away the ancient mortar between the stones. It took hours. His fingers bled. The knife blade bent. But finally, one stone shifted. Then, another. Working in the fading afternoon light filtering through the broken window, Elias removed stone after stone until he'd cleared an opening about 2 feet square. Beneath was darkness, and a smell, dry, cool air rising from somewhere below. Elias didn't have a flashlight. He gathered dry wood and cloth from the ruins and made a torch, lighting it with his compass and the last of his tinder. Then, with his heart hammering so loudly he could hear it in his ears, he lowered himself through the opening. His feet found a ladder, old iron rungs bolted into stone. He descended slowly, testing each rung before trusting it with his full weight. The ladder went down about 15 feet before his boots touched solid ground. He held the torch high. He was in a tunnel, not a natural cave. This had been deliberately excavated, the walls smooth and reinforced with timber beams. The tunnel extended in one direction, sloping gradually downward into the mountain. Elias hesitated. Every survival instinct screamed at him to climb back up, to not venture into an unknown tunnel alone with only a makeshift torch. But something stronger pulled him forward. Curiosity, hope, the desperate need to believe that maybe his suffering had a purpose. He started walking. The tunnel was narrow enough that he could touch both walls with his arms outstretched. The air was cool and dry, untouched by wind or weather for decades. His torch cast dancing shadows on the walls. After about 100 feet, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. And there, Elias stopped breathing. The chamber had been carved from solid rock and reinforced with timber supports. Along one wall were wooden crates, their surfaces covered in dust, but otherwise intact. Along another wall were shelves containing leather-bound books, glass bottles, and metal instruments whose purpose Elias couldn't identify. And in the center of the chamber, on a reinforced wooden table, sat a metal strongbox. Elias approached slowly, as if the objects might disappear if he moved too quickly. The strongbox was locked, but the lock was old, a simple mechanism that yielded after Elias worked at it with his knife for several minutes. Inside were documents, yellowed papers covered in neat handwriting, technical drawings, photographs, maps, and beneath everything else, something wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Elias unwrapped it with trembling hands. It was a leather journal, remarkably well preserved. The first page bore a name and date. Thomas Whitaker, Mine Superintendent, Silver Ridge Mining Company, January 1887. Elias carefully turned the brittle pages, reading by torchlight. What he discovered in that journal would prove to be worth far more than silver or gold. It was evidence of a crime that had been buried for over a century, and it would make him the most important witness to a truth that powerful people had tried desperately to erase. The journal entries began routinely. Daily logs of mining operations, silver yields, worker schedules. Thomas Whitaker's handwriting was precise and methodical, the notes of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. But as Elias read deeper, the tone changed. March 15, 1887. Found something today in the deepest shaft. Not silver. The men who discovered it are frightened. They say it's cursed. I say it's evidence of something far worse than any curse. April 2, 1887. Sent samples to an independent assayer in Carson City, bypassing company channels. The results confirm my suspicions. The company has known for months. They've been lying to the workers, lying to the town, lying to everyone. April 20th, 1887. They're closing the mine. Not because the silver ran out, there's still plenty, but because of what else we found. The company director came himself today with lawyers. They're offering money to keep everyone quiet. Some are taking it. I can't. May 1st, 1887. I've hidden the evidence. The samples, the assay reports, the correspondence proving the company knew. They've ordered us to seal the tunnels and evacuate the town within 30 days. They're calling it mineral depletion. That's a lie. The truth is we found something in the rock that proves this land was never theirs to mine. We found proof that this entire operation is built on stolen territory and a massacre they covered up. May 15th, 1887. This is my last entry. They've threatened my family. I'm leaving Silver Ridge tomorrow with my wife and daughters, but I'm not taking this evidence with me. It's too dangerous. I'm sealing it here in a chamber only I know about, beneath my house. If anyone finds this journal, know this. The Silver Ridge Mining Company built their fortune on land stolen from the Western Shoshone tribe after a massacre in 1862. The company bribed territorial officials to falsify land deeds. They buried the evidence, literally. But 25 years later, we dug it up. We found them. The bodies. Dozens of them. Women, children, elders. Buried in the silver seams, hidden where no one would ever dig. The company chose profit over truth. They chose to seal the mine rather than face what they'd built their empire on. I pray someone with a conscience finds this one day. Thomas Whitaker. Elias sat in the darkness, the torch burning low, reading the words again and again. The implications were staggering. The Silver Ridge Mining Company hadn't abandoned the town because the silver ran out. They'd abandoned it to bury evidence of a massacre. And Thomas Whitaker had hidden proof of everything. Elias examined the other items in the chamber with new understanding. The leather-bound books were company ledgers showing financial transactions, payments to government officials, bribes, falsified land surveys. The photographs showed the mine in operation, but one set of images made Elias's stomach turn. They depicted skeletal remains being excavated from the deepest tunnels, carefully documented, before being reburied somewhere unknown. The maps showed the original territorial boundaries of Shoshone land, and how those boundaries had been illegally redrawn after an incident labeled simply as hostile conflict, 1862. The glass bottles contained soil and rock samples, each labeled with technical notations. And in one of the wooden crates, Elias found something that made everything else pale in comparison. Human remains. Carefully wrapped, preserved in the dry air of the sealed chamber. A child's skull, small enough to fit in Elias's hands. Beside it, a note in Thomas Whitaker's handwriting. This child was approximately 8 years old. Found in Tunnel 7, depth 400 feet. Buried with 12 others. The company wanted them destroyed. I couldn't allow that. They deserve to be known. They deserve to be mourned. They were human beings, not obstacles to profit. Elias carefully rewrapped the remains, his hands shaking. He wasn't just looking at historical artifacts. He was looking at evidence of genocide. And he was holding proof that one of the largest mining fortunes in American history, a fortune that had built banks, railroads, and political dynasties, was founded on mass murder and stolen land. His torch was burning out. He needed to get back to the surface before darkness trapped him underground. But as he climbed back up the iron ladder with the journal clutched under his arm, Elias understood something fundamental had changed. He was no longer just a homeless child hiding in ruins. He was a witness. And witnesses had power. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He lay in his shelter in the ruined house, the journal beside him, thinking about what to do. Part of him wanted to climb down to Millerton, walk into the sheriff's office, and hand over everything he'd found. But he'd learned through hard experience that authorities didn't always care about truth, especially when truth was inconvenient. He thought about Father Martinez at St. Anthony's, who'd been kind but ultimately unhelpful. He thought about Officer Bradshaw, who'd threatened him with detention. He thought about all the adults who'd seen him suffering on the streets and chosen to look away. Why would they suddenly care about justice for people who'd been dead for over a century, when they couldn't even care about a living child right in front of them? No, Elias realized. He needed someone who couldn't ignore this. He needed someone whose job was specifically to expose hidden truths. He needed a journalist. The next morning, Elias made the long walk back to Millerton. He moved carefully, staying off the main road, approaching the town from the backside where fewer people would notice him. The public library was in a brick building near the old courthouse. Elias had spent countless hours there when he'd lived in town, using the computers before his library card expired, and the librarians started watching him too closely. He waited until late afternoon when the library would be busiest, then slipped inside among a group of high school students. The computers were in the back, and most were occupied. Elias waited patiently until one freed up, then sat down quickly. He had maybe 20 minutes before someone noticed him and asked him to leave. He searched investigative journalists, Nevada, historical crimes. He searched reporters, Native American land rights. He searched journalists who expose corporate corruption. Name after name appeared. Most were affiliated with major newspapers or networks, people too important, too distant, too unreachable for a homeless child. But then he found her, Rebecca Hartman, independent journalist based in Reno. Her website showed investigations into cold cases, historical injustices, and environmental crimes across the American West. She'd exposed illegal mining operations on tribal land. She'd documented the poisoning of water supplies by corporate negligence. She'd won awards for investigations into missing Indigenous women. And, critically, her website had a contact form specifically for anonymous tips. Elias glanced around. The librarian was helping an elderly man with printing. The other computer users were absorbed in their own work. He opened the contact form and began typing. My name is Elias. I'm 10 years old. I found something in Silver Ridge that you need to see. Evidence of a massacre. Bodies. Documents proving the Silver Ridge Mining Company was built on stolen land and mass murder. This is real. Please come. He hesitated before adding his location. If the wrong people found out where he was, he'd be forced to move again. But if he wanted anyone to take him seriously, he needed to give her a way to find him. I'm living in the ruins. I'll watch for you. Come alone. He hit send before he could reconsider. Then he cleared the browser history, logged off, and slipped out of the library. 3 days passed. Elias began to think the journalist wouldn't come, that his message had been ignored or dismissed as a prank. He spent the time making copies of key pages from Thomas Whitaker's journal, carefully transcribing them onto notebook paper he'd scavenged. If something happened to the original, at least the information wouldn't be completely lost. On the 4th day, he heard a vehicle approaching Silver Ridge. He immediately hid in his usual spot, the old church cellar, where he had a clear view of anyone entering the ghost town. A dusty SUV navigated carefully up the deteriorated road and parked near the center of the ruins. A woman got out. She was maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a canvas jacket. She had a professional camera around her neck and a backpack slung over one shoulder. She stood in the middle of the ruined main street, turning slowly, taking in the ghost town. Then she called out, Elias? My name is Rebecca Hartman. I'm the journalist you contacted. I came alone like you asked. Her voice was clear and direct, not condescending or falsely sweet. Elias watched her from the shadows for several minutes. She didn't look impatient. She didn't look skeptical. She just waited, occasionally taking photographs of the ruins. Finally, Elias made his decision. He emerged from a church cellar and walked slowly toward her. Rebecca turned when she heard his footsteps on the packed earth. Her expression shifted immediately, not to pity or disgust, but to something like recognition. She'd seen children like him before. Elias. He nodded. I'm Rebecca. Thank you for trusting me enough to reach out. She didn't approach him, giving him space. You said you found evidence of a massacre. Can you tell me more? Elias studied her face carefully, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. He'd learned to read adults, to see the difference between those who genuinely wanted to help and those who wanted to use you for something. Rebecca Hartman's eyes were tired but kind. Her hands didn't fidget nervously. She waited patiently for him to speak, not rushing him. It's underground, Elias finally said. In a hidden chamber, beneath one of the houses. There are documents, photographs, human remains, evidence that the Silver Ridge Mining Company covered up a massacre of Shoshone people to steal this land. Rebecca's expression didn't change to skepticism. Instead, she nodded slowly. The Silver Ridge Mining Company, she repeated. That would be Whitakerton Industries now. They're still one of the largest mining conglomerates in the western United States. They've diversified into real estate, water rights, renewable energy. She met his eyes directly. If what you found is authentic, it would be devastating to them. They've spent over a century building a reputation as ethical corporate citizens. Evidence of genocide in their founding would be worth covering up, Elias finished. Yes. That's why I contacted you instead of the police. Rebecca smiled faintly. Smart kid. Can you show me? Elias led her through the ruins to the superintendent's house. The opening in the floor was still uncovered from his previous visit. Rebecca examined it carefully, then looked at Elias with new concern. You've been climbing down there alone? Elias, that's incredibly dangerous. These old mines can collapse or have toxic gases. I know, Elias interrupted, but no one else was going to find this. And it matters. Something in his voice made Rebecca pause. Yes, she said quietly. It does matter. She pulled a professional flashlight and rope from her backpack. I'm going down first. I have experience with this kind of investigation. If it's safe, I'll call you down. If it's not, we'll figure out another way. Okay. Elias nodded. Rebecca secured the rope and descended into the tunnel, her flashlight illuminating the darkness below. Elias waited at the opening, listening to her movements echoing up the shaft. Several minutes passed. Then he heard her voice, distant but clear. Elias, come down. Carefully. He climbed down the iron ladder, finding Rebecca standing in the tunnel, her flashlight beam playing across the walls. Her expression was intense, the look of someone who'd just confirmed a terrible suspicion. This is real, she said quietly. This is all real. She followed him into the chamber. For the next hour, Rebecca methodically documented everything. She photographed the journal, the ledgers, the maps, the photographs, the soil samples. She handled the wrapped remains with reverence, photographing them in place without disturbing them. She recorded audio notes, speaking her observations into her phone. Thomas Whitaker documented everything, she said, reading the journal entries. He tried to do the right thing, and the company silenced him with threats. She looked at Elias. This is one of the most important historical discoveries I've ever seen. But you understand what happens next, right? This is going to become very big, very fast. There will be lawyers, federal investigations, media coverage. Will you tell them about me? Elias asked. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. That depends. Do you want me to? Elias thought about being invisible. About 3 years of being ignored, dismissed, treated as worthless. Yes, he said. I want people to know I found this, that I mattered enough to find something important. Rebecca nodded. Then I'll make sure they know. But first, we need to secure this site and contact the proper authorities, tribal authorities, not just federal. This is evidence of crimes against the Shoshone people. They should be the first to know. She made several phone calls from the tunnel entrance where she could get a signal, speaking in low, urgent tones. Then she turned to Elias. "We have a problem. It's going to take the tribal authorities at least 2 days to get here from the reservation. Federal archaeologists may be longer. But Whitakerton Industries has local representation in Millerton. If anyone reports seeing a journalist in Silver Ridge, they'll send people to investigate." "We need to guard the site," Elias said. "Yes, but I can't ask you to." "This is where I live," Elias interrupted. "I've been guarding it for weeks without knowing what I was guarding. I can do it for 2 more days." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. "You're 10 years old. You shouldn't have to be responsible for something like this." "I'm already responsible for it. I'm the one who found it." She sighed. "I'm not leaving you here alone. I'm staying too. I have camping gear in my vehicle, and I'm not letting a child guard a crime scene without backup." For the first time in 3 years, Elias felt something he'd almost forgotten. Protected. Someone was staying. Someone wasn't leaving him alone. That night, they camped in the ruins together. Rebecca had professional camping equipment: a tent, sleeping bags, a camp stove. She cooked them both a hot meal, the first Elias had eaten in months. As they ate, she asked him questions. Not about the discovery, about him. "How long have you been living here?" "A few weeks." "Before that, on the streets of Millerton for 3 years." "What happened to your parents?" "House fire. I was 7. No family to take me." Rebecca nodded, not with pity, but with understanding. "The system failed you." "The system forgot me." "That's going to change," she said firmly. "When this story breaks, you're not going to be invisible anymore." Elias wasn't sure if that was a promise or a warning. That night, sleeping in a borrowed sleeping bag in Rebecca's tent, Elias experienced something he'd almost forgotten. Warmth. Safety. The knowledge that someone was watching over him while he slept. The next 2 days passed slowly. Rebecca worked on her laptop, writing articles, coordinating with her editors, communicating with tribal authorities and federal agencies. Elias showed her around Silver Ridge, explaining how he'd survived, the water collection system, the wild plants, the hiding spots. Rebecca was quietly impressed. "You are remarkably resourceful," she said. "Most adults couldn't survive out here alone." "Most adults wouldn't have to," Elias replied. On the afternoon of the second day, vehicles began arriving. First came representatives from the Tamok tribe of Western Shoshone, elders, tribal historians, and their legal counsel. Rebecca met them at the edge of the ruins, and Elias watched as she briefed them on what had been found. The reaction was profound. One of the elders, a man in his 70s with long gray braids, stood silently at the tunnel entrance, tears running down his weathered face. "Our grandfather's grandfather spoke of this," he said quietly. "Of the place where families disappeared. Of the silver mountain built on blood. They said no one would ever believe us." He looked at Elias. "This child believed us." Federal archaeologists arrived the next morning, along with FBI agents specializing in historical crimes. The site was immediately designated a federal investigation area. The superintendent's house and the entire tunnel system were sealed off as evidence. And then the media arrived. News crews from Reno, Las Vegas, Salt Lake City. National networks within 48 hours. The story exploded across the country. Child discovers evidence of covered-up massacre in Nevada ghost town. Homeless boy uncovers corporate genocide. Mining fortune built on mass murder. The Silver Ridge scandal. Rebecca's article ran in major newspapers and online platforms, carefully written to center the Shoshone perspective, while documenting Thomas Whitaker's brave attempt at whistleblowing. And in every article, every news segment, every interview, Rebecca made sure Elias was mentioned, not as a curiosity, not as a tragic victim, but as the person whose survival and determination had brought hidden truth to light. Whitakerton Industries immediately mobilized a crisis response team. Lawyers descended on Silver Ridge. Corporate representatives issued statements denying knowledge of any historical crimes. They offered settlements to the tribe, money to make the story go away. But the tribe refused. "This is not about payment," the tribal chairwoman stated in a televised press conference. "This is about truth, acknowledgement, and justice for our ancestors. And it's about honoring a child who cared enough to reveal what powerful corporations tried to hide." The legal battles would last for years. But the narrative had already shifted. Elias had become a national figure, a symbol of how those society discards sometimes see truths that everyone else misses. Child welfare organizations used his story to advocate for system reforms. Journalists wrote about the thousands of children like him who fall through bureaucratic cracks. And most importantly, people began asking questions. How does a 10-year-old child end up homeless for 3 years without anyone noticing? Why didn't the foster care system protect him? Why didn't the town of Millerton help him? Why does it take a child discovering evidence of genocide before anyone acknowledges he exists? Officer Bradshaw, who threatened to arrest Elias for being homeless, was interviewed by reporters. "We were just doing our jobs, enforcing vagrancy laws," he said defensively. "Your job," a reporter replied, "was to protect children." He was 10 years old and living on the streets for 3 years. Where were you? The officer had no answer. The town council members, who'd voted for the Community Renewal Initiative, suddenly became impossible to reach for comment. Mrs. Chun, the store owner who'd left bread for Elias, cried during her interview. "I wish I'd done more," she said. "I saw him. I knew he needed help. But I just left bread. I should have brought him inside. I should have found him a home." Father Martinez announced that St. Anthony's Church would establish a permanent shelter for homeless youth, funded by donations that poured in after the story broke. "We failed Elias," he admitted publicly. "We won't fail the next child." But the most significant change came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the discovery, Elias received a visitor at the hotel where Rebecca and Child Services had temporarily housed him. A woman in her 60s, elegantly dressed, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to carry decades of sadness and wisdom. "My name is Catherine Whitaker," she said. "Thomas Whitaker was my great-great-grandfather." Elias stared at her. "He disappeared from family history," Catherine continued. "We knew he worked for the Silver Ridge Mining Company, but there was a gap in our records, years where no one seemed to know what happened to him. And then he died young, under circumstances that were never clear." She pulled a letter from her bag. "After your discovery became public, I started researching. I found this in my family's archives. It's a letter my great-great-grandmother wrote to her sister in 1887, just after they left Silver Ridge." She handed it to Elias. The paper was brittle, the handwriting faded, but still readable. "My dear sister, Thomas did something very brave and very dangerous. He discovered evidence of terrible crimes, and he refused to stay silent. The company threatened our family. We had to leave everything behind. But before we left, Thomas hid the proof. He said that one day someone with a conscience would find it. He believed that truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful men try to bury it. I pray he's right." Catherine's eyes were wet. "He was right," she said. "And you were that someone. My great-great-grandfather would be proud that a child, someone pure enough to care about truth over profit, was the one who found his evidence." She paused. "I've established a foundation in Thomas Whitaker's name, dedicated to supporting children in foster care and homeless youth. I'd like you to be the first recipient of a full scholarship, housing, education, everything you need through college." Elias couldn't speak. "But more than that," Catherine continued, "I'd like you to help guide the foundation. You understand what children in your situation need in ways that adults never could. Your voice matters." Elias found his voice. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you care about me?" Catherine smiled sadly. "Because my ancestor cared about truth more than safety. And you do too. That kind of courage deserves to be honored, not abandoned." 6 months after discovering Thomas Whitaker's hidden chamber, Elias's life had transformed completely. He lived in a foster home with a couple former teachers, who'd been moved by his story and specifically requested to care for him. He attended school for the first time in 3 years, quickly catching up to his grade level and surprising teachers with his intelligence and curiosity. He worked with the Whitaker Foundation, speaking at events about foster care reform and youth homelessness. He testified before Congress about gaps in the child welfare system, and he remained in contact with the Tamok tribe, who'd officially honored him in a ceremony as a friend and ally of their people. The Silver Ridge site became a protected historical area and memorial. The tribe worked with archaeologists to properly honor and rebury the remains found in the tunnels. A museum was planned to tell the true story of what happened there. And at the entrance to the site, a plaque was installed with 2 names. Thomas Whitaker, who risked everything to document the truth. Elias, who made sure the truth was finally heard. No last name for Elias, because by then he'd legally changed it. He'd taken the name of the man whose courage inspired him. Elias Whitaker. On the 1-year anniversary of the discovery, Elias returned to Silver Ridge with Rebecca Hartman and Catherine Whitaker. They stood at the entrance to the sealed tunnel, now protected by a permanent structure that would allow controlled archaeological access while preventing vandalism. "Do you ever regret finding it?" Rebecca asked. "Your life became so complicated after that." Elias shook his head. "Before I found the chamber, I was invisible. I didn't matter. I was just surviving day to day, with no purpose." He looked at the ruins of the ghost town, remembering the desperate child who'd arrived here fleeing from a world that didn't care if he lived or died. "Now I know I matter, not because I'm rich or famous, but because I helped give voice to people who were silenced. I helped expose a truth that needed to be told." He turned to Rebecca. "You asked me once if I wanted people to know I found this. I said yes because I wanted to matter. But now I understand something else." "What's that?" "It's not about me mattering. It's about making sure people who are treated as worthless, like I was, like the Shoshone families were, are seen and honored. That's what matters." Catherine put her hand on his shoulder. "My great-great-grandfather believed that truth couldn't be buried forever. You proved him right." As they walked back through the ruins together, Elias thought about all the children who were right now living on streets, in alleys, in places where adults chose not to see them. He thought about how close he'd come to dying in these ruins, forgotten and alone. And he thought about how a desperate search for shelter had led him to something far more valuable than survival. It had led him to purpose. The journalists eventually left Silver Ridge. The federal investigation continued for years, resulting in historic acknowledgments and reparations. Whitakerchin Industries was forced to confront its founding crimes, though the legal battles dragged through courts for decades. But for Elias, the most important outcome was quieter and more personal. He'd gone from being invisible to being unforgettable, not because of what he'd found, but because of what he'd chosen to do with it. He could have kept the discovery secret, maybe even tried to sell artifacts on the black market. He could have run away when things got complicated. But instead, he'd chosen to be a witness, to make sure that forgotten voices were finally heard. And in doing so, he'd transformed from a child nobody wanted into someone nobody could ignore. 5 years later, Elias graduated high school as valedictorian. He gave a speech that was streamed nationally, talking about how society measures value and who gets to matter. "When I was 10 years old," he said, "I was worthless in the eyes of my community. I was an inconvenience, a problem to be removed. But worthlessness is not a truth. It's a lie we tell ourselves to justify ignoring people who need us. Every person has value. Every story matters. Every truth deserves to be heard. The question is, are we brave enough to listen?" He went to college on a full scholarship, studying anthropology and public policy. He continued working with the Whitaker Foundation, which expanded to serve hundreds of homeless youth across multiple states. And he never forgot the ruins of Silver Ridge, the place where a desperate child discovered that even when the world treats you as invisible, your actions can still change everything. On his 21st birthday, Elias returned to Silver Ridge one final time. The museum had been completed, telling the complete story of the massacre, the cover-up, Thomas Whitaker's bravery, and the discovery that finally brought truth to light. Elias walked through the exhibits, reading the stories of the Shoshone families who'd been murdered, seeing the documents he'd found carefully preserved behind glass. At the end of the museum was a special exhibit about homelessness and invisible children, featuring Elias's story as a reminder that society's most vulnerable members often hold keys to its most important truths. Standing before that exhibit, Elias felt the full weight of his journey. From a 7-year-old who'd lost everything, to a 10-year-old surviving alone in ruins, to a young man who transformed personal tragedy into collective healing. He placed his hand on the glass case containing Thomas Whitaker's journal, the artifact that had changed everything. And he whispered a promise to every child who felt invisible, worthless, forgotten. I see you. You matter. Your story deserves to be told. Because Elias Whitaker had learned the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the people society throws away are exactly the ones who discover what everyone else was too comfortable to look for. That courage doesn't require power. It only requires caring enough to tell the truth. And that a single child, armed with nothing but determination and the belief that truth matters, can expose lies that have lasted for generations. They had laughed at the orphan living in the ruins, but he had unearthed a secret worth more than gold. He had unearthed justice, and in doing so, he had unearthed his own worth, which had been there all along, waiting for someone to finally notice.